Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Carmines Arena, a cultural gourmet of information, if you will, a feast for your mind and soul. And now, without further delay, the man, the myth, the maestro, Carmine Arena.
Greetings, and welcome once again to Carmines Arena, site of contest and conflict, venue for and of resolution. Resolution in terms of focus, in terms of resolution, and in terms of heading towards the preservation, the propagation, and the celebration of Western civilization. This episode, entitled The Perversity of Diversity, represents my 88th lecture on Carmines Arena. That, to a pianist, is a significant number, for 88 are the number of keys on the piano, encompassing somewhat more than the complete range of the symphony orchestra. And it does this comfortably and magisterially. Such be this my instrument, which has found and continues to find place and purpose throughout our pulsing, pluralistic planet. Since its ingenious invention early in the 18th century, its universality has become a creative, irrepressible necessity. It's taught me the imperative to remain endlessly teachable, and this mandate I humbly obey to the very tips of my fingers, fingers whose nerve endings reach out to sense the mystery, the magic, and the miracle of music, music worthy enough to court an unravaged silence. It follows then that the piano is a wondrous coalescence of art and science, because their union is an unashamed expression of highbrow sensibilities. And I employ it in this episode to underscore the futility of today's fashion to achieve diversity via lowbrow avenues which course through the dark, garbage-filled slums of minds incapable of appreciating pride of place, much less the genius of place. Thus, the lust for diversity, in which and or behind which the lowbrow hide in particular from themselves while walking abreast, or let us say in tandem, with a crony cum cohort, each abetting the other's escape into decline, decadence, unto demise on far shores away from self, where their reach falls ever short of grasp. Grasp in this instance meaning comprehension as opposed to their cohesion, which remains unwilling to integrate with the prevailing dominant culture. Among the willfully unfit or gluttonously unfulfilled, diversity remains a seductive delusion. The concept of a global village is at once the product of a frontal cortex which suffers from permanent adolescence. And what is it that the adolescent wants, or better still craves? It craves instant gratification, disparages disagreement of itself, casting judgment into disposal heaps set aflame by fervor and fever of hardened passions. Adolescence is the obsolescence of education, and the pillage of an unearned and ill-spent allowance. Permanent adolescent ages, but rarely grows out of this condition, deserving of entitlement and the endless quest for same. It finally reaches voting age only to coagulate into a decadent, degenerate electorate, a voting bloc of blockheads who cheerfully and cynically chide and cheat their superior host so as to ensure they remain inferior, but well-fed and doctored. As I've maintained countless times, to ignore local genius in a perverse search for diversity by these otherness seekers results, when it triumphs, into a Pyrrhic victory. By that is meant a victory more costly than defeat. What is lost is a native culture that is swallowed up in a slurry of relativism, diluted unto imperceptibility, seasoned with an unstylish, tasteless sense of the now. The treasury of local genius lost may only be restored via the treasure map called history, history, that neglected guide to past insanities. You've heard me state at the head of this 88th episode, and I reiterate once more for emphasis, multiculturalism can only work among people elevated enough to be considered highbrow. Even prodigious children can attain this status, for they possess the gifts, the freshness, and the innocence which early discovers the adult in the child and never surrenders the child in the adult to be. Though you may not be a prodigy, you are nonetheless invited to recover via past history, and that history's recorded recognition of your failures. It is then you are readied to welcome home your better angels, angels respectful of and productive of valid accomplishments, not your run-of-the-mill, chump-change mediocrities, those who use multiculturalism like a hammer. But when you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Whereas the elite among us are masters of their vocation. In music, for example, hints of crossover influence energize the advancement of both art and its endless striving toward density of detail, precision, incisiveness, and the beauties of perfection. Here, East meets West in harmonic communion, certainly not in collision. This is true of the sciences as well, but the disciplines of art and science stand apart from the unruly crowd, the hysterical mob of undisciplined, uneducated, or worse, miseducated bumpkins who steadfastly refuse integration and, yes, Americanization, despite its craze for diversity. Multiculturalism and global village virtues, they refuse among all of these to ever integrate but demand independent recognition merely because they honor us by their illegal presence. Well, my friends, it's more like us who have been dishonored, as we, behaving the same way, would dishonor the foreigner in his own country, in his own culture, his home turf, were we to permanently park and poke about while politicking for, say, kosher pork, purposely being contrarian, making darn sure we'll never inspire agreement. In truth, the concept behind multiculturalism is a cutesy-poo verbal camouflage hiding its creep and crawl attack on sovereignty. And may I remind, or better still alert you, to the fact that sovereignty is the immune system of a nation's culture, a barrier fending off parasitic cultural subversion. Each nation is entitled to its local genius. I cannot stress nor repeat this declaration enough. Just think of how countries of Europe border one another in close proximity. Yet, how different is German from French, French from Spanish, Spanish from Finnish, Italian from Hungarian? Each grammar, its sounds, syntax, and semantics are its own, understood by its children, and yes, each even summons its pet dog in his very own homegrown lingo. I say, vive la différence. Multiculturalism frequently finds itself, even with the best of intention, making mistakes that are sadly hilarious. For example, a favorite of mine is this great American novel, The Grapes of Wrath, translated by a Japanese writer to this title. Get this title: Angry Raisins. That's a trampling out of vintage, where the japes of laughs are scored. Glory, glory, Yokohama. Consequently, I'm all for variety, but opposed to being devoured by multiculturalism, because those who push for diversity are generally of a progressive vintage, a vintage pressed last week, which believes in diversity of all things except, of course, the diversity of thought. If you dare think differently, you are demonized as backward, stupid, and yes, bigoted. My response is the offer to let them eat cake drizzled with red wine vinegar. How about that for diverse? I repeat, multiculturalism works in the arts and sciences, as with the Italian invention of the piano. And it also works in the many examples of true love. I, myself, am the product of a Jewish mother and an Italian father who lived together for 67 years, then died 14 months apart, leaving me today feeling like an orphan. Opposites often initially attract, but when they wed in the absence of true love that is, which to me is always a hugely human accomplishment and therefore rare, when they wed in the absence of true love, it is not too long after that each is shocked by the other not being more like him or herself. Note how the poet Kipling put it. East is east, and west is west, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. But there is neither east nor west, border, breed, nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth. What makes a man and or woman strong is the possession of spiritual muscle, which recognizes God's judgment. This is so utterly different from the secular progressives' global village hype, which forever seeks not morality, but plurality lost to behavioral monstrosities and immeasurable mendacity. And so apart from art and science, true love, rarer than we wish to admit, is more than able and equipped to subsume multiculturalism, diversity, and globalism. All the world, the whole world loves a true lover. From the vantage point of my years, I've come to know the greatness of love, the mystery, magic, and miracle of its power, but also its mischief when used as a disguise to further individual agenda and a false love whose noise drowns out the voice of our better angels and desensitizes our best instincts. Speaking of which, allow me to give you an example of our best instincts. Recently, I came across the following information concerning a Swiss enclave. Basically a quiet, tiny, and remote community in the Alps. For the common good, they agreed by a nearly unanimous vote to to accept the burying of nuclear waste, mind you, generated by Swiss nuclear power plants, and accept the risk. Then the Swiss government thought to sweeten the deal by proffering an annual check for man, woman, and child of $8,000 per person residing in said enclave. This offer, which I wish to make clear, was enacted after the initial vote in favor had taken place. As soon as the government's offer was made, though, those in the original voting bloc turned against the nuclear disposal idea. They claimed that what they had been willing to do for the common good had been corrupted by what was now perceived as a bribe. You see, I hope, how their best instincts overcame venality, a greed become all too common when evoked by political conjuring. That same spirit also arose in New York City. The mayor thought to institute a program to pay children to come to school. It was tried and failed abysmally. Apparently, Mayor Bloomberg couldn't get lowbrow enough to be popular with those he'd systematically reject as in-laws, but would hope to incorporate under the Todd banner of inclusion. Well, even the lowbrow among us appear to have a hands-off attitude when it comes to turning on their corruption valve. Academia has and continues to suffer from self-imposed wounds. In the anonymous name of multiculturalism, degraded to nihilism and its contempt for standards in that all too hasty pace to embrace a collective refusal to make judgments about behavior. All in the adolescent attempt to hide its greed, no, its lust, to appear trendy and cutting edge. Though its best cutting edge is its yen for ever higher tuitions, which it can quite easily offset by skimming the mere surface of its billions and billions of dollars sacked in its endowments, instead of leaving its beloved student body with the mortal wounds of crushing debt. Education reduced to the scab on the saw for learning. In very fact, skewed learning that blinds them from their perpetual ignorance. Learning no longer leaving one highbrow, but destitute and unable to afford a plumber. Drip, drip, drip. While academia, given its love for the deceptions of socialism, sponsors a philosophy and a practice that eventually always runs out of people to mug. These academic types, these people with photographic memories who've run out of film. I remind you of the poet Kipling's strong men and women by inference. Strong men and women who haven't allowed schooling to get in the way of education, know full well that they must first tame themselves, and by doing so, begin to indelibly realize the futility of ever taming the weak. Those weak of mind, weak of heart, and most importantly, weak of spirit, which when potent reaches out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. For such as these, yesterday's vices never become today's fashion. The poorest, most neglected people have been the Navajo Indians, and yet it's well to remember that their respect for what I've been calling the genius of place allowed them against all odds to retain their native tongue. Those who know their history well recall that it was the Navajo language which was employed in World War II in the Pacific Theater of Combat, used as a military communications code to deceive the Japanese High Command. a command that was never able to decipher this baffling grammar, these odd sounds, this syntax or semantics. It was a linguistic triumph that otherwise would have been blown away by multiculturalism and its influences. Such was the power of the Navajo village, as opposed to the global village appetite for the fast foods of thought, that staple diet of Alpo. Now, excuse me, at Christmastide, there are knee-jerk protests each year by secularists to rid the public square of the nativity scene so as to spare the feelings of the multicultural straw men. In this case, inclusion and all-inclusive sensibilities are persuaded to, you guessed it, exclude and censor. Such be the perversities of diversity. Allow me to give you another example or two about the perversities attendant upon diversity training. The United States government paid a Chicago firm and its consultants hundreds of thousands of dollars to put on diversity training workshops that, according to one watchdog group, included an exercise in which employees were told to chant, "Our forefathers were illegal immigrants." They were led in this repeated chanting by a speaker pounding on the table and getting others in the room to join in. This training is nothing more than a ruse to indoctrinate impressionable minds, and folding same into a mindset. That these creatures even dare to reference our forefathers is a glaring depiction of chutzpah. For many would be loath to acknowledge that the forefathers mentioned had believed in marriage and motherhood and knew who their father was, each held in fond memory. Here's another timely anecdote sent to me by a regular listener. A U.S. Navy destroyer stops 4 Mexicans in a rowboat rowing towards California. The captain gets on the loudspeaker and shouts, "Ahoy, small craft, where are you headed?" One of the Mexicans puts down his oar, stands up and shouts, "We are invading the United States of America to reclaim the territory taken by the United States during the 1800s. The entire crew of the destroyer doubled over in laughter. When the captain is finally able to catch his breath, he gets back on the horn and asks, "Just the 4 of you?" The same Mexican stands up again and shouts back, "No, we're the last 4. The rest are already there." So much for truth and comedy. It's time to face facts. 40% of all workers in Los Angeles County out of 10.2 million people are working for cash and not paying taxes. The majority are illegals working without a green card. 95% of warrants for murders in Los Angeles are for illegals. 75% of people are on the most wanted list in LA. Those on the wanted lists are illegals. Over two-thirds of all births in Los Angeles are to illegal Mexicans on Medi-Cal, whose births were paid for by taxpayers. Nearly 300,000 illegals in LA are living in garages. The FBI reports that half of all gang members in Los Angeles are illegals. Nearly 60% of all occupants of HUD properties are illegals. 21 radio stations in LA are Spanish-speaking. When they're speaking to their English audience, they say one thing, but when they're speaking to their Spanish audience, and I understand them, believe me, they say something entirely different. In Los Angeles, 5.1 million speak English. They don't understand what's going on. 3.9 million speak Spanish. They get it. In LA, they demonstrated to translate the American anthem to Spanish. Such is diversity, which moves one way. Less than 2% of illegals are picking our crops, but 29% are on welfare. Over 70% of the U.S. annual population growth are illegals. 29% of inmates in federal prisons are illegals. I'm not making this up, nor am I making up the following. Here the shoe is on the other foot. The state of Sonora sent 9 of its legislators to Tucson, Arizona, to protest new employer crackdowns on illegals from Mexico. It seems many Mexican illegals are returning to their hometowns, and the officials in Sonora are chagrined and resent the return of their own people. Such, I repeat, are the perversities of diversity. Where in Mexico the rich get richer, and here the rich are seen as fit for mugging. Indeed, indeed, such is the perversity of diversity. 'Tis enough to make one an angry raisin. Now, I've put this aside, sent in by a listener, and I should like to let you hear just 10, we don't have the time, I don't believe we have the time, but just a little bit of what the new immigration laws of Mexico are. Listen. Number 1, there will be no special bilingual programs in the schools. Do you know how many billions we've spent on bilingual education? I can give you maybe 2 or 3 other programs just on that topic. Take it from me. Number 2, all ballots will be in this nation's language. I guess the Mexicans don't like to press 2 for English. Number 3, all government businesses will be conducted in our language. Non-residents will not have the right to vote no matter how long they are here. Non-citizens will never be able to hold political office. Foreigners will not be a burden to the taxpayers. No welfare, no food stamps, no health care or other government assistance programs. Any burden will be deported. Foreigners can invest in this country, but it must be an amount at least equal to 40,000 times the daily minimum wage. If foreigners come here and buy land, options will be restricted. Certain parcels, including waterfront property, are reserved for citizens naturally born into this country. Foreigners may have no protests, no demonstrations, no waving of a foreign flag, no political organizing, no bad-mouthing. Our presidents must never be criticized. I can go on and on. They've learned a lot about us, and they've learned not to be over generous with their prosperity, where they would be mugged and chided for miscarried charity. Yes, we can learn from them. 'Tis enough to make one an angry raisin. Till next time, my friends, keep the faith.
If you have any comments or other remarks, and that I perhaps could even read on some of these broadcasts, please do not hesitate to write to me, Carmine Arena, P.O. Box 1029, Larchmont, New York 10538.